But we take it very seriously, and that's the reason why we're working hard to secure a better future for New Zealanders.
The Honourable Member Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. It's a frightening thought to think of Mr Ryle's mantelpiece. There'll be the share certificates alongside the Whakatane Amateur Dramatic Society Most Improved Player Award. But the truth is that for Mr Ryle to say that nurses around the country are queuing up to buy these shares, these will be the same nurses protesting against Mr Ryle because they actually don't have enough money to pay the power bill, let alone buy the power company. And let's just take one of Mr Ryle's words there for a little bit. Who's really looking after the small elite here? Is it this side of the House that wants to see these assets stay in the hands of all New Zealanders, or is it that side of the House who wants to see them sold off eventually to foreign hands? That side of the House is the one looking after the small elite. This side of the House is the one saying that we should continue to have these assets in public ownership for all New Zealanders. Mr Ryle says that the Labour Party doesn't believe New Zealanders can be trusted. We believe New Zealanders can be trusted to retain these assets for future generations, not like that side of the House who want to sell them off, hock them off, and make sure that New Zealanders won't have them in the future. Nick Smith is chirping in, and I just think it is appropriate to mention what the 1990s National Government did do, given that that's what the Minister has just done. BNZ, New Zealand Rail, the Ministry of Works, Radio New Zealand Commercial, Contact, half of Auckland Airport. They're not talking about that now, are they? That's what they sold in the 1990s. In the 2000s, a Labour government had to come in and buy back the rail because it had been run down so badly. Buy back most of Air New Zealand because it had been run down so badly. The record of this side of the House is far stronger on growing New Zealand's asset base than that government over there and the Minister in charge of this bill who was in a cabinet that hocked off those assets. Mr Chair, I want to talk about my SOP on this part. Clause 16 is an excellent SOP. Clause 16 to introduce a new section 45Y on restriction on holdings in companies with control of water resources. And I want to do that, Mr Chair, because there is little more that binds all but Air New Zealand of these assets together than water. The control and the rights to use water. It is an essential part of this debate. We've already heard others speak about the importance of these issues for Tūwhare Toa in the context of their issues. We've got the Maori Council claim in place as well, Mr Chair. And so on this side of the House, we believe that it is actually important to say if we've got a resource like water, a resource that is for all New Zealanders, that resource should remain in the ownership of all New Zealanders. Now, I don't expect the National Party to agree with this. I don't expect the National Party to say, yes, we believe that water is a resource that should remain in the ownership of all New Zealanders. But I would expect it out of some of the people who are voting for this bill. And I think the Honourable Peter Dunn needs to take some ownership of this matter, because Peter Dunn said in October last year, this is what he said. He was talking about all of the things about asset sales that pained him, and this is what he said. Thirdly, and one that I feel particularly deeply about, is water. This is Peter Dunn. I do not intend to wait until it is on the asset sales agenda. I do not believe New Zealanders would ever or should ever accept a sell-off of the supply of water or any of the aspects around it. So if Peter Dunn believes that he doesn't want to see the sell-off of the supply of water or any aspects around it, he should be supporting my SOP to say that, well, I think he will. I think he will support my SOP because he's bound to see SOP number 59 and say, I stood by the words that I said in October 2011 that water should not be privatised. And that's effectively what's happening here, Mr Chair. Water being privatised by stealth through the sale of these assets. So Peter Dunn should come down to this House and say, yes, I'm standing by what I said in October 2011. I'm actually going to say I'm not going to let these asset sales go through because they compromise the fundamental things that he has said that New Zealanders believe, that water is something that belongs to all of us, that its privatisation will fundamentally undermine these assets. It will also fundamentally undermine the principle that New Zealanders believe in about access to water resources. So I challenge Peter Dunn. I don't expect the National Party to support this because I know that the privatisation of water is on their agenda, but I do expect Peter Dunn to come down to this House and say that he would like to support this. Mr Chair, the other matter I want to mention is clause 1645Q around the treaty issues. And I want to pick up the words that the Minister used just before. Mr Chair. Mr Chair.
I call the honourable member Grant Roberts.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair, and my colleagues, I'm sure, will have a lot to say on this clause when I finish in a few minutes. When Tony Ryle was speaking on clause 45Q, he said that the reason that the new treaty clause only applies to the Crown and not to other shareholders is because it only applied to the Crown in the SOE Act. Well, the reason it only applied to the Crown in the SOE Act is because the Crown was the only owner of the shares. So it's a ridiculous argument to make to say that the Crown is the is a simple transfer of the rights and obligations of the Crown into this new Act. That is a ridiculous proposition, Mr Speaker. It is a ridiculous proposition to say that only some of the owners of these assets now have obligations under the treaty. And Mr Chair, I want to refer the government members to the National Policy Statement on Freshwater Management that this national government signed itself up to. And I want to read from the preamble of that, Mr Chair. This is what it says. The Treaty of Waitangi is the underlying foundation of Crown-iwi-hapu relationship with regard to freshwater resources, addressing tangata whenua values and interests across all of the wellbeings and including the involvement of iwi and hapu in the overall management of freshwater are key to meeting obligations under the Treaty of Waitangi. This government's recognised that issues to do with water are critical to the relationship with Māori. They've recognised that. But here we are, standing in a debate where we've got a treaty clause that only applies to part of these assets. Now, it only applies to the Crown's aspects of these assets now. That is, but exactly, Mr O'Rourke, half the water. It's only half, or 49% of the water. How are they going to do that with half? Is it the half that's in Mr Foss's glass here? I don't know. We don't know because this clause now only applies to the Crown. Mr Chair, there is no doubt that the government has tied itself in knots with clause 45Q of this bill. They didn't know what to do. The Māori Party were looking for a way out, and so they went with a ridiculous premise that because under the SOE Act it only applied to the Crown, it can only apply to the Crown now. It applied to the Crown under the SOE Act because the Crown were the owners of those assets. It should apply across the board, and Mr Mallard has an amendment in his name to make sure that those principles apply across the board. If the National Party has any faith whatsoever in this National Policy Statement on Freshwater Management, they will adopt Mr Mallard's amendment and actually make a sensible treaty clause here that applies right across the companies. It is a ridiculous proposition to try and say it only applies to the Crown. It is a ridiculous proposition to put forward a bill that transfers water rights away from New Zealanders, that effectively begins the privatisation of water, something that is definitely on the National Party's agenda, but it should not be done by stealth. They should be upfront about this, and if they're not, they should support my amendment to this clause.
Point of order.
Point of order, the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
Mr Chair, I seek leave that I seek leave that a 30-minute allocation be provided in the next call, so that the Honourable Peter Dunn, who has not spoken in this debate, can participate.
No, the member can't seek leave for someone else. I call the Honourable Parakura Horomia.